On your screen is the current world under-8 champion Marc Llari. He's playing against David Rennkamp and he moves his knight to c6. Currently the position is roundabout even. Black brings his rook to e8 and now the pawn here is hanging. What will Marc do here? He wants to push his pawn forward and he has a very nice little trap in mind. He pushes it to e7. So if black were to take here, bishop takes e7, then knight takes b4 would be hanging because the rook is pinned here. So instead his opponent makes the smart move king f7 and Marc gets his king into the game. Bishop takes pawn. Now, will you go into the pawn endgame or will you keep the pieces on the board? That is the big question here. The youngster decides to trade. He takes rook takes e7, rook takes, knight takes, and king takes e7. We have a very interesting pawn endgame. White brings his king up, and now white has a majority here, 3 versus 2, and black has a majority on the queen side, 3 versus 2. Who's winning this? King comes up to d6. Now the white king comes up, and black puts his king on d5. The position is objectively even. b3 is played here and now black plays his pawn up to c5. So the black pawns have started to roll. However, the white king is stopping them. The most difficult task is to know which pawn actually to move. The youngster decides to play pawn to g3. And now c4, a pawn sacrifice. White takes it, king to c5. And now there's a possibility of creating a passer here, or even to push the pawn to a3. Now the best move here for white to try and play for a win is to go h4. It's a very strong move. But Marc here tries to take his time and decides to go f4. This is not the best move because you weaken the e3 square and also e4. And that's the reason why the position now is drawn. He pushes the pawn to b3. And is he going to take the pawn? Yes, he takes it, and there's no point pushing the pawn to a3 because the white king can stop it. So black takes the pawn back. And now king to c3 played, b2. King takes b2 and king takes c4 is on the board. The game is now equal, and even though right now black is a pawn down, he has an active king, and that's the reason why it's not so easy to win. And now you see what I was saying about the e4 square being weak. The king cannot be pushed away from here. And now black has 2 moves that draw. He can push his pawn to g6 or push his pawn to h5. He decides to push it to h5. This is a good move. Pawn to h5. And now king f2. You can still wait here with g6, or you can even push the pawn to h4 with more pieces, more pawns coming off the board. The position is drawn. He goes pawn to g6. And now Marc can play king e2 when his opponent will have to play h4. The youngster is thinking. He has 3 minutes on the clock. He plays king to g2. King comes into e3. And now black king is quite active. He goes king h3. If white can get the king here, he would be completely winning as the pawn would push forward. So black plays a nice move, stopping the white king from advancing. But anyway, he advances. And now the only move to draw is to go in with king g2, which he does. King to g2. And now h3 played. King comes to f3. And you can't push g4. The f4 pawn is weak. So he goes king g5, sacrificing his pawn on g3. So black takes. If you take on g6, then he would take on f4. And so you can't take it. He goes pawn up to h4. And now king f3, smart move. The position is very close to being drawn. Black has defended this endgame admirably. And now f5 is the last attempt by Marc. Pawn takes, and now king takes on f5. The only drawing move here is the very important move king e3. And the point is, after king g5, king e4, king h5, king f5, you box the white king and it's a draw. But instead he blunders with king g3, and you can see the youngster there very surprised with what his opponent has done, and goes king g6, and the h pawn is queening. David resigns and Marc wins there. What a turnaround right at the very end. So the game was won by the talented youngster Marc Llari here. And what I realized is that there were a lot of little nuances that were hidden under the surface. And so I want to record this and also ask you certain questions where you can pause this video and try to think what are the moves that can be played for both sides here. So let's begin with the game from the pawn endgame, because it was not at all trivial. White brought his king up. Black played his king to d6. White played king d3. Black played king d5. b3. All fine until now. c5. And I think this was the first moment where we needed to think a bit, because if white were to take the pawn, it's still drawn. But after c4 check, king c2, and now king c6, f4, king b6, g4, king a5, h4, I take the pawn. And now the problem is that I'm actually going king a3, taking this pawn and pushing. And the moment I go king a3 and you go king b1, I play c3, c2. You are forced to take. I take on a2 and my pawn queens. So maybe the most logical, if you go king b2, there's c3 anyway. So the most logical thing is to keep pushing. Takes, king a3, king b1, c3, f5, c2, takes, king a2, f6, take, b3, b2, f7, and queen, and the game ends in a draw. So this is one variation that could have happened. But in the game, Marc played the move g3. Very logical move. I think a good move here. And black here went for c4. It was not required to do this. In fact, he could have also just pushed his pawn to h5. But okay, c4 is not a bad move. Takes king c5. And at this point, white had the best move to put pressure on black was h4. And now the first question I want to ask you is, what would you play here as black to play? Okay, so there are two moves which hold here. Let's first look at the move, maybe not the correct move in this position, and then we can go on to the correct one. So b3 is not a right move. b3 is a question mark move, because after take, king c3, you have to play b2, takes. And now this is very similar to the game position, with the only difference that the pawn is on f4 in the game and back on h2. And here the pawn is on h4, and makes a huge difference, because when the king comes to e4 and the white king comes to e2, you can push the black king away with f3. So king c2, king d4, king d2, king e4, king e2, and now h5 is met with the move f3, and now comes the move king f5. And here's my question to you. The second question, what should white play here? White to move. Here it's an important move. To make progress, you should take the diagonal opposition with king d3. And the reason is, after king e5, you have king e3. And after g6, you have g4. Takes, king f6. And now king d4. Very important. not to rush with king f4, because then after g5 the game is drawn. So king d4, king here, king e4, king d5, and slowly white wins this game. However, if you are not careful and you play king e3, then after the move king e5, the position is a draw. And one of the main reasons is that after g4 here, you take, pawn takes, and you have this very nice little move g6. When it's zugzwang for white, he's not able to win this position, because if king f3, you have king f6, important move here. Because we know that king f4 would win for white if he were able to get the opposition, but there's g5 move, and if he goes king e4, there is king e6. So this is a very well-known drawing position. This is a draw. My question was that in this position, if white plays king e2, what would you play here as black to play? Well, if you got tempted by the move king d4, well, too bad. It's a losing move, because after king d2, you are going to lose. If you go king d5, I have king d3. If you go king e5, I have king e3. And this is lost. Here, king d4. The right way to draw in this position is to take distant opposition with king e6, so that if king e3 comes, you go king e5. If king d3 comes, you go king d5. And this is a draw. So this was about the move here b3. It's a bad move for black. Let's look at another inaccurate move, which is h5. This is also a mistake, because after f3, good move, which is the only winning move here for white, f3, with the idea of g4. G6, here you go g4, h takes, f takes, b3, take. And now here's a question for you. What do you play here as white to move? It's important to just calculate things very, very deeply here. So if you observe closely, white's way of drawing black's only way of drawing this game is to go here with his king, because otherwise white is just going to play h5 and win this game. So even if you manage, let's say, to take this pawn, h5 is winning. So the right move here is not h5. If you found this move, then you are wrong, because after take, by the way, g5 is met with h4. It's a draw. Take, king b4. Very important move. h6, king a3. h7, b2. Queen, and it's a draw, because it is also a check. So the move here is actually king c3, which is the best move. And in fact, after b2, you take, king takes, and h5 wins. Because if you just look at this position, and you know the rule of square, if you make a square to the end of the board this way, the black king is outside the square. Even though it's his move, he can only come back here and he's out of the square. So white wins. By that logic, in fact, even the move king d2 draws here, because after king c4 you have h5, but after king b4 you have to play the move king c1, king a3, you go king b1, and next move you're just going to play h5 or this pawn wins. So king d2 was also winning in this position. Okay, so we saw both the wrong moves here, which were b3 and h5, but imagine that you play the move here g6, which is the correct move in the position. And this one, now white has a few ways to try and fight for the full point still. Let's say he goes g4. And now the problem is for white that he's given up this square. So in that line where we were going b3 in this position, take king c3, b2 takes this entire variation. Now king f4 is possible, and this position is just a draw. King g3 is a good move, forcing matters. King takes h5, and it's a draw. King g3. So g4 does not work, and h5 is the other move in this position which you want to play instead of this. And I think again this is the best chance to fight for a win. What would you play here as black? Again, the only move for black. So there are two moves here. One is to push g5, the other is to take. The most logical move seems g5 because it doesn't let white create a passer, but it's a losing move because after f4 takes b3, which is the only way to create some play. I take and I play f5, and now this is just lost because there's no counterplay. If you play b2, I go king c2. If you take the pawn, my pawn is queening already. And if you go king b4 trying to go king a3, this time I am just too fast because I come with a check. So g5 loses, and the right move here is g takes h5. White plays the move f4 because he wants to queen. What do you do here with black? Black to play. There are two moves which draw here. One is king d6. Very, very tough move to make. It's just a backward move. King d4. And now I just go king c6. Waiting move here. Simple move because b3 seems tempting, but after takes king c3, you just lose the pawn. So king c6, waiting, king d3. And now what do you play here as black? So if you were tempted into playing king c5, that's losing move because f5 is winning now. King d6, king d4, b3 takes, and now the very important king c3, king e5 takes, king b4, and somehow you are just in time for winning this. So king d3 is the critical move here. You have to go back, and then after king d3, the critical move is king d6 here, not king c5, and then you are able to hold this game as well. Okay, so that was about the move here. If you played g6 and white goes h5. Another move which ends in a draw here after h4 is a3. Important move. King c2 is forced because b3 is the threat. So king c2, king c4, h5, b3. Again, this is the only move to create play. Takes, g4, queen takes. And now important move. What would you play here as black? Yes, if you were to play king c3, it's losing because after the move f5, king d4, g5, I'm threatening f6 followed by g takes h6. And if you play the move, king e5, it still have f6, takes and takes here, winning for white. So the right move here is king c4. And now the same thing no longer works because I'm just in time to stop. And in fact, it's black who wins this game. So king c4 is correct and the game would end in a draw. So a3 is also a way to hold this. And we saw g6, h5 move. We saw all other moves which are here. So h4, that covers h4, and I think that would have been the best try for white to put pressure. And I think that would have, I think this was the main thing that I want to analyze here. So many possibilities. f4 was played in the game, and now of course this was an equal endgame. Takes h5, good move. There was also h4 here, but he went g6, king g2, king e3, king here. By the way, if he had gone king e2 here, then the only move to hold is h4. It draws. Say for example, king e2, h4, king f2. I can take, you take, and then I can just go here. A very important move, g5. And now the game is drawn. It's an important drawing line here. So king g2, king e3 here, king f3, king h4, king g2, king back, takes h4. I mean, if you play here, this is a draw. So h4, king f3, f5 takes, and now what's the only move to draw this game is king e3, because when you take, I can box you in and then just come back, and if I get a chance to come in and draw the game. But king g3 was a big blunder, because now you cannot box my king in, and white went on to win. So this was a very instructive king and pawn endgame. I hope you learned a lot from it. It was played on the amateur board at the World Rapid Team Championship, below 2000 board. That was the 6th board, and but still such an important game, and the youngster Marc Llari is going to make big ripples in the world of chess in the years to come. So wishing him all the best, and a big congratulations for the win. His opponent David Rennkamp fought well, but in the end made the final error.